Welcome to my channel.
The rain in Lochdu did not fall so much as it hovered, a fine grey saturation that turned the surrounding mountains into ghostly silhouettes and the waters of the loch into lead. It was the sort of weather that discouraged ambition, which suited Police Constable Hamish Macbeth perfectly. Hamish sat in the kitchen of the police station, a building that served more as a personal larder and a sanctuary for his dog, Lugs, staring with deep concentration at a pot of coffee. He was a tall, lanky man with a shock of fiery red hair and eyes the colour of the Highland sky after a storm. To the casual observer or the bureaucrats at headquarters in Strathbane, he looked like a man who had forgotten how to move. In reality, he was calculating the exact moment he could slip down to the river to liberate a salmon without being spotted by the fishery warden. "It's a quiet life, Lugs," Hamish murmured. The ugly, lop-eared dog thumped his tail once against the linoleum, and if we're lucky, the telephone will stay as dead as the weather. But luck was a fickle mistress in Sutherland. Peace was not broken by the telephone, but by the aggressive roar of a high-performance engine echoing through the village's narrow main street. Hamish sighed, rose slowly, and peered through the window. A gleaming, oversized silver SUV, entirely too wide for Highland tracks, was parked crookedly outside the Tommel Castle Hotel. Out stepped a man who looked as though he had been designed by an pensive London marketing firm. He wore a crisp, mustard-coloured waxed jacket that had clearly never seen a speck of real mud, and a pair of designer Wellingtons that cost more than Hamish's monthly salary. This was Julian Vane Tempest. He had arrived 3 weeks ago with the loud intention of rejuvenating the village by turning the old derelict cannery into an artisanal wellness retreat. "Look at him," Hamish whispered to Lugs, "a Sassenach with more money than sense and a tongue like a whip. He'll be looking for me soon, complaining about the quaintness of our local plumbing, or the fact that the sheep don't cross the road in an orderly fashion." Sure enough, Vane Tempest was currently shouting at Mr. Johnson, the mild-mannered proprietor of the grocery store, about the lack of organi. See avocados. The newcomer's voice carried on the damp air, sharp, arrogant, and entirely devoid of the slow, melodic lilt of the north. He was a man who viewed Lochdu not as a house, but as a backdrop for his own importance. Hamish settled back into his chair and poured a mug of coffee. He had a feeling that Mr. Vane Tempest was the kind of man who brewed trouble as easily as he brewed resentment. In a village like Lochdu, where secrets were kept like aged whiskey, rubbing the locals the wrong way was a dangerous pastime. Let him shout, Hamish decided, closing his eyes. The salmon aren't going anywhere, and neither am I. But the darkness of the Highlands has a way of creeping in when the clouds hang low. And before the coffee in Hamish's mug had even gone cold, the peace of Lochdu woe old be shattered by something much noisier than a silver SUV. The silence Hamish so dearly craved lasted exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds. It was ended not by the roar of an engine, but by a high-pitched, curdling scream that sliced through the Highland mist like a serrated blade. Hamish sat bolt upright, the sudden movement causing Lugs to scramble for purchase on the linoleum. The scream had come from the direction of the old cannery, the very site Julian Vane Tempest intended to transform into his temple of artisanal vanity. With a heavy groan that acknowledged the death of his peaceful afternoon, Hamish reached for his uniform cap, adjusted it crookedly atop his red hair, and stepped out into the drizzle. He set off at a deceptive pace, a long-limbed, shambling gait that looked easy but covered ground with surprising speed. As he approached the rusted gates of the cannery, he found Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, standing by the entrance. Her face, usually set in a permanent mask of moral disapproval, was now a ghostly shade of parchment. She pointed a trembling, gloved finger toward the main processing floor of the derelict building. "It's Mr. Vane Tempest, she sped, her voice fluttering. "I was merely passing by to hand him a flyer for the church jumble sale. Someone has to teach these Londoners about charity, and I saw him. Oh, Hamish is quite excessive." Hamish nodded vaguely, his blue eyes already scanning the muddy ground for prints before he entered. "Stay back, Mrs. Wellington. It's no place for a lady, jumble sale or no." He stepped inside. Tea. His cannery was a cavernous shell of corrugated iron and rotting timber, smelling of ancient salt and damp earth. In the centre of the room stood a massive, Victorian-era industrial vat, a relic of the building's history that Vane Tempest had bragged about keeping as a postmodern centrepiece. Now it serves a more macabre purpose. Julian Vane Tempest was dead. He hadn't just been killed, he had been staged. The Englishman was slumped over the edge of the great iron vat, his mustard-coloured jacket stained a deep, visceral crimson, but it was the nature of the scene that made Hamish's thin eyebrows rise. Vane Tempest's mouth was stuffed full of expensive imported chocolates, the gold foil wrappers glinting ironically in the dim light. Around his neck hung a hand-lettered sign written in B. Old aggressive ink, too much ice, never enough. It was a bizarre, humiliating end for a man who had spent his life demanding the best of everything. Hamish stood perfectly still, his hands deep in his pockets. He didn't touch anything. He didn't need to. He observed the way the blood had pooled, the lack of struggle on the dusty floor, and the specific brand of the chocolates, Valrhona, the kind O'Neill, sold at the hotel's luxury gift shop. "Oh, man," Hamish sighed, looking down at Lugs, who was sniffing suspiciously at a discarded gold wrapper. "You had to go and get yourself murdered in a way that requires a full report. And with chocolates too, Blair will have a field day with the metaphors." The annoyance he felt was genuine. A simple stabbing or a falling masonry accident would have been a local matter, perhaps easily solved over a drama at the pub. But a staged murder with a cryptic note meant the big men from Strathbane would be descending on Lochdu like a plague of locusts. He looked at the victim's face. Vane Tempest looked surprised, his eyes wide, as if he couldn't believe the Highlands had dared to provide him with an experience he couldn't complain to a manager about. Hamish's mind began to whir behind his sleepy expression. Who hated Vane Tempest enough to choke him with his own luxury? The list was long. There was the local builder he'd refused to pay, the hotel maid he'd insulted, or perhaps one of the many villagers who viewed his wellness retreat as a direct assault on their way of life. He heard the distant, rhythmic throb of a police siren wailing in distance, growing louder as it wound its way along the Lochside Road. That would be Detective Chief Inspector Blair, no doubt already envisioning the headlines and the promotion that would come from solving a high-profile murder of a wealthy Londoner. Hamish took one last look at the sign around the dead man's neck. The ink was slightly blurred by the humidity, but the handwriting was precise. He work of someone who didn't just want Vane Tempest dead, but wanted him mocked. He stepped back out into the rain just as a dark blue police sedan screeched to a halt, splashing mud over Hamish's trousers. "Macbeth!" a voice bellowed before the car door was even fully open. DCI Blair emerged, his face already the colour of an overripe plum, looking as though he'd been nursing a grudge since the moment he woke up. "I swear to God, if you've contaminated my crime scene with that mangy beast of yours, I'll have you directing traffic in the middle of the Atlantic." Hamish put on his most vacant village idiot stare, letting his jaw hang just a fraction. "Good afternoon to you too, Inspector. It's a sad business, surely." "Very chocolatey." Blair stomped forward, his heavy boots squelching in the mud, ignoring Hamish's comment entirely. He was followed by Detective Sergeant Anderson, who looked as if he had been sucked dry of all joy by years of serving as Blair's punching bag. The inspector pushed past Hamish, nearly knocking him into a gorse bush, and stormed into the cannery. A few moments later, his roar of disbelief echoed off the corrugated metal walls, startling a flock of crows from the rafters. He emerged a minute later, his neck bulging over his collar, his small eyes darting around the yard as if looking for someone to arrest immediately. "Chocolates?" Blair spat, the word sounding like a curse. "The man is stuffed like a Christmas goose with fancy sweets and wearing a bloody sandwich board. This is a mockery, Macbeth. This is a direct insult to the Strathbane Criminal Investigation Department." "It does seem a bit pointed, sir," Hamish replied mildly, patting Lugs to keep the dog from growling at Blair's shiny shoes. though I doubt the killer was thinking of the department when he was choosing the truffles. It's more likely a local grievance. Mr. Vane Tempest wasn't exactly what you'd call a people person. He had a way of looking at the villagers as if the why were part of the scenery that needed a good scrubbing. Blair turned on him, his finger jabbing the air. I don't need your amateur psychology, you ginger-haired simpleton. It's obvious what happened here. This is a crime of passion, or a robbery gone wrong. Look at that jacket. It's worth more than your house. I want a list of everyone in this miserable village who owes money, everyone who's been in prison, and everyone who looks like they couldn't afford a chocolate bar. Starting with that shifty-looking fellow who runs the grocery store. I heard Vane Tempest shouting at him this morning. Motive, opportunity, it's practically solved. Hamish sighed, a long, tired sound he caught before it could reach Blair's ears. Mr. Johnson wouldn't kill a fly, sir. He is Bowls Club treasurer. Besides, he's got a bad back. He couldn't lift a man of Vane Tempest's weight into that vat if his life depended on it. Are you telling me how to do my job? Blair screamed, his face turning a shade of purple that matched the Highland heather. I am a detective chief inspector. You are a village bobby who spends more time poaching fish than policing. Get out of my sight. Go and... I don't know. Count sheep. Just stay away from my crime scene before you trip over your own feet and ruin the footprints. As you wish, Sir Hamish said, sketching a lazy salute that only infuriated Blair further. He turned and began to wander back toward the village, lugs trotting faithfully at his heels. He didn't look back at the flurry of activity, the white-suited forensics team arriving, the yellow tape being strung up, or the flashes of cameras illuminating the dark interior of the cannery. Hamish knew Blair's obvious conclusion was as hollow as the chocolates in the victim's mouth. A robbery gone wrong didn't involve poetic irony or hand-lettered signs. This was a crime of deep, simmering resentment, executed with a theatrical flair that suggested the killer had enjoyed every second of it. As he walked, Hamish didn't head for the police station. Instead, he made his way toward the Tommel Castle Hotel. If the chocolates had come from the gift shop, the hotel was the center of the web. It was also the place where the Sassenach set gathered to drink gin and tonic and complain about the lack of high-speed internet. The rain was starting to turn into a steady downpour now, the kind that oaked through even the best-oiled wool. Hamish felt the familiar gnaw of hunger in his stomach. He hadn't had his lunch, and the sight of those gold-wrapped sweets, disturbing as it was, had reminded him that he'd missed his mid-morning biscuit. He slipped into the side entrance of the hotel, avoiding the main lobby where the tourists might see him. He needed to talk to Nellie, the head housekeeper. Nellie knew the movements of every guest, the contents of every suitcase, and more importantly, who had been seen visiting Julian Vane Tempest in the late hours of the night. He found her in the linen room, a cedar and steam sanctuary. She looked up, her sharp eyes softening when she saw the dripping, bedraggled policeman. I suppose you've heard then? She asked, not waiting for him to speak. About the fancy man at the cannery. I have indeed, Nellie, Hamish said, leaning against the doorframe and looking entirely unthreatening. DCI Blair thinks it's the grocer. What do you think? Nellie snorted, a sound of pure Highland derision. Mr. Johnson? That man couldn't keep a secret, let alone a murder. No, Hamish. You want to look at the friends he brought up from London. There was a Di, if you can call her that, who arrived 2 days ago, tall, blonde, and looks like she's been sucking on lemons. They had a row in the dining room last night that rattled the chandeliers, something about a lost investment and a broken promise. Hamish straightened up, his lazy demeanour sharpening just a fraction. A lady with a grudge and a financial motive. It was a start, but as he looked at Nellie, he noticed she was holding a crumpled piece of paper she'd found in one of the guest rooms. And Hamish, she added, lowering her voice, she wasn't the only one. There's a man in room 4 who spends all his time cleaning a set of very expensive, very sharp kitchen knives. He says he's a chef looking for work, but I've never seen a chef who looks that much like a debt collector. Hamish nodded. Ed, his mind already beginning to piece together the social geometry of the hotel, a lady with a temper and a chef with knives. "Thank you, Nellie. You wouldn't have a pot of tea, would you? It's a terrible day for a murder." Nellie sighed, but it was the sigh of a woman who enjoyed having an audience for her observations. She poured a thick, dark stream of tea into a chipped mug and pushed a plait, containing a lone, slightly stale scone toward Hamish. "That's all I can spare before the afternoon service starts, Hamish. And don't you be getting crumbs on my clean tablecloth." Hamish took a grateful sip, the tea heat radiating through his damp bones. He looked like nothing more than a stray dog seeking shelter, a man whose only ambition was to finish his snack and perhaps find a warm spot be the fire. But as he chewed the scone, his mind was cataloguing the guests Nellie had mentioned. "The blonde lady," he said, his voice casual. "The one with the lemon-sucking face. Would that be the one staying in the Sutherland suite? The one with the silk scarves and the habit of snapping her fingers at the waiters?" "The very one," Nellie replied, leaning in closer. "Mrs. Cynthia Vane Tempest, his ex-wife, though she still uses the name like a weapon. She arrived in a taxi from Inverness, looking like she'd come to collect a debt. And that chef I told you about, the one in room 4? His name is Marcus Thorne. He's been seen whispering with Cynthia in the conservatory when they thought no one was looking, but they didn't look like lovers, Hamish. They looked like two people discussing a B.U.-C.ness transaction that involved a great deal of unpleasantness." Hamish nodded, memorizing the names. "And the chocolates, Nellie, the gold-wrapped ones from the gift shop. Have many guests been buying those lately? Only 2 boxes were sold this week," Nellie said with a triumphant glint in her eye. "One to Mr. Vane Tempest himself. He had a terrible sweet tooth, that one. And the other to a little man who checked in 3 days ago. A Mr. Pringle. He says he's an amateur historian studying Highland clearances, but he spends all his time sitting in the corner of the bar watching people. He bought a box yesterday afternoon, claiming they were a gift for his sister." Hamish drained his tea and stood up, smoothing his uniform. The picture was becoming more crowded, and therefore more interesting. He had an ex-wife with a grudge, a mysterious chef with a professional toolkit, and an historian who bought the exact murder weapon, or at least the prop, used in the cannery. He stepped back out into the hallway, Lugs following with a hopeful glance back at the scone plate. Hamish needed more than hotel gossip. He needed to hear what the village was saying. He made his way toward the curry and chips shop, a small aromatic establishment run by Mr. Patel, who served as the unofficial hub for Lochdu's evening rumours. As he entered, the bell jingled, and the smell of turmeric and frying potatoes enveloped him. Mr. Patel was leaning over the counter, talking in low, urgent tones to the postmistress, Mrs. Kennedy. They both stopped abruptly when they saw Hamish, but their faces didn't hold the usual wariness they reserved for the police. To them, Hamish was just Hamish, a man who might ignore your lack of a fishing license if you gave him a decent tip on the weather. "A sad day, Hamish," Mr. Patel said, though his dark eyes twinkled with the excitement of the scandal. "A very strange way to go. Choked on luxury, they say." "The news travels fast," Hamish remarked, leaning against the counter. "I haven't even finished my first cup of tea, and the whole village knows the menu of the murder scene." "What else are they saying, Mrs. Kennedy? I'm sure the post office has heard the whispers." Mrs. Kennedy adjusted her spectacles. "They're saying Julian Vane Tempest wasn't just building a retreat, he was planning to buy up the old pier and close off the public access. He had the papers drawn up. He was going to turn our loch into a private pond for his wealthy friends. My nephew works for the solicitors in Strathbane, and he saw the correspondence. Vane Tempest was a greedy man, Hamish. He wanted to own the very air we breathe." "Greed," Hamish mused. "It fits the sign around his neck. But who in Lochdu has the stomach for such a theatrical killing? It takes a certain kind of person to stuff a man's mouth with chocolate after they've killed him." "It takes someone who felt cheated," Mr. Patel added, sliding a small bag of chips across the counter toward Hamish. "On the house, for the hard work you're doing. You know, Vane Tempest had a visitor last night at the cannery. Not one of the fancy hotel guests. A local. I saw a battered green Land Rover parked near the gates around 10 o'clock. It looked remarkably like the one belonging to Archie McLean." Hamish took a chip, the salt stinging a small cut on his lip. Archie McLean was the local builder Whodunit Tempest had supposedly refused to pay. Archie was a man of immense strength and a shorter temper, a true Highlander who believed that a debt was a matter of honour, not just paperwork. The pieces were SW. Arling now, the ex-wife, the chef, the historian, and the local builder. Each had a thread of motive, but only one had the particular blend of malice and irony required to stage such a scene. Hamish knew he wouldn't find the answer in a lab. He would find it in the things they weren't telling him, and the way they looked when he mentioned the word Valrona. As he stepped out of the chip shop, he saw DCI Blair's car speeding toward the hotel, the inspector no doubt ready to harass the guests and make a spectacular mess of the delicate social fabric Hamish was trying to untangle. Hamish sighed and bit another chip. It was time to find Priscilla. If anyone knew the true financial rot behind the Vain Tempest name, it would be her. The salty warmth of the chips provided a temporary shield against the biting Highland wind as Hamish made his way toward the outskirts of the village. He knew DCI Blair would currently be in the hotel lobby, likely shouting at the receptionist and making a grand show of securing the premises, which gave Hamish exactly the window he needed to speak with someone who actually understood the victim's world. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was the daughter of the Lochdu gentry, and while she often viewed Hamish with a mixture of affection and exasperation, her knowledge of the upper-class vultures who circled Lochdu was unparalleled. He found her near the estate stables, looking effortlessly elegant in a quilted riding jacket that made Hamish feel even more like a dishevelled heap of wet wool. "I heard the news, Hamish," she said, her voice cool but not unkind, as she stroked the neck of a large chestnut hunter. "The village is buzzing like a disturbed hive. A murder in the cannery? And involving chocolates, if the rumours are to be believed." "The rumours are uncharacteristically accurate today, Priscilla," Hamish replied, leaning against a wooden fence post, while Luggs sat obediently in the mud. "Julian Vain Tempest has met a very sweet and very permanent end. I've just come from the hotel. There's an ex-wife lurking in the suites, and a man with a set of knives in room 4 who looks like he's waiting for a signal. What can you tell me about the man himself? Was he as wealthy as he pretended to be?" Priscilla tied the horse's lead and turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "That's the interesting thing, Hamish. My father had a business meeting with Julian last week regarding the pier. Julian was desperate. He was throwing money around, or the promise of money, but he was trying to borrow against assets that didn't seem to exist. He wasn't a dreamer, he was a gambler on his last hand. That wellness retreat wasn't just a project. It was a desperate attempt to launder his reputation and perhaps more. Launder? Hamish picked up the word immediate. Telly. You mean he was using other people's money? Exactly. And from what I've gathered through the grapevine, Cynthia, his ex-wife, was his primary creditor. She didn't just come here for a row, Hamish. She came because she realized the well had run dry. If Julian died, her settlement would be tied up in probate for years, or disappear entirely. She's cold, yes, but she's also practical. Killing. The man who owes you millions is rarely a sound financial strategy. Hamish nodded, taking a final cold chip from the bag. Unless his death triggers an insurance policy that she controls. But what about the local angle? Archie McLean's Land Rover was spotted at the gates last night. Vain Tempest owed him for the initial survey work and the clearing of the site. Archie is a proud man, Priscilla mused, walking with Hamish toward the main house. But he's also a traditionalist. If he were going to kill Julian, he'd do it with his bare hands in a fair fight, not by stuffing him with Valrona truffles and hanging a sign around his neck. That part of the crime, the theatricality of it, that reeks of someone who felt Julian's very existence, was an aesthetic insult. It's too clever, Hamish. Too London. Hamish paused, the gears of his mind turning. The theatricality was indeed the sticking point. A local would have left him in the loch. A professional hitman would have left him one clean hole. But this was a performance. You mentioned he was gambling, Hamish said softly. Was he gambling with the wrong people? He was gambling with everyone, Priscilla replied. Even TR. IED to charm Elspeth Grant into writing a glowing piece for the regional paper to drive up interest in his investment fund. She rejected him, of course. She said he reminded her of a snake in a tailored suit. Elspeth is a good judge of character, Hamish agreed. He felt a pang of the usual complication that came with his feelings for both women, but he pushed it aside. The timeline was tightening. If Julian was a fraud, then every guest at that hotel was a potential victim of his schemes, and therefore a potential killer. As they reached the edge of the estate, the sound of a distant car horn signalled Blair's return to the village centre. Hamish knew he had to move fast before the inspector arrested Archie McLean simply because he had large hands and a loud voice. He thanked Priscilla Ann. Dee began the trek back, his mind lingering on the quiet Mr. Pringle, the historian who had bought the chocolates. A man who watches is a man who knows when a gambler is bluffing, and in Lochdu a bluff was often called with a very sharp edge. The walk back to the village centre was a damp, sombre affair, the rhythm of Hamish's boots on the asphalt providing a steady beat for his racing thoughts. Priscilla's insight into Vane Tempest's crumbling finances changed the geometry of the crime. If the dead man had been a hollow shell of a millionaire, then the motive wasn't just greed. It was the fury of those who had been tricked into believing in the dream. As he rounded the bend that led to the police station, the sight of a familiar green Land Rover parked outside, hemmed in by two police rusers, made Hamish's heart sink. DCI Blair was standing on the pavement, his face a triumphant shade of magenta, while Archie McLean was being led toward the station in handcuffs, his massive shoulders hunched in a mix of rage and bewilderment. "Caught the brute, Macbeth," Blair bellowed as Hamish approached. "Found the murder weapon's twin in his glove box. A half-eaten bar of that fancy chocolate. 8. And the Land Rover matches the description of the vehicle seen at the gates. Case closed. You can go back to your poaching. The real police have finished the job." Archie looked at Hamish, his eyes pleading. "I went to see him, Hamish. I went to get my money. He gave me a box of those sweets as a gesture of goodwill. I told him where to shove them and left. He was alive when I walked out of that cannery. I swear on my mother's soul." "Save it for the cells, you Highland thug," Blair barked, shoving Archie toward the door. Hamish stood silent, watching the procession. He didn't argue. He knew that arguing with Blair was like trying to teach a pig to whistle. It wasted your time and annoyed the pig. Instead, he waited until the heavy station door slammed shut. Then he approached the Lan. D. Rover. He looked out the window for evidence Blair had found, a bar of Valrhona chocolate indeed. But something felt wrong. Hamish moved to the rear of the vehicle, his eyes scanning the muddy floor mats. There, snagged on a rusted bolt in the trunk, was a tiny, almost invisible tuft of blue silk. It was a thread, no longer than an inch, but its colour was a striking electric azure. Hamish Riak. Head out with a pair of tweezers he kept in his pocket and carefully retrieved it. It was expensive material, the kind used for high-end scarves or linings of couture jackets. Archie McLean's wardrobe consisted entirely of heavy wool and oilskins. "Och, Blair," Hamish whispered, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the hotel. "You've caught the muscle, but you've missed the mind." He whistled foe. Our lugs and began to walk back toward the Tommel Castle Hotel. If the thread was what he thought it was, it didn't belong to Archie, nor did it belong to the lemon-faced Cynthia, who had been dressed in sombre beige and creams. He remembered the blonde woman's silk scarves, but she had been wearing a muted palette. The electric blue was a statement, a splash of colour that belonged to someone who wanted to be noticed, or someone who had been trying very hard to hide their presence. He detoured through the hotel garden, approaching the side entrance once more. He didn't want to see the guests in the lobby. He wanted to see their laundry. He found Nellie again, who was now busy sorting a fresh pile of linens. "Nellie, a quick word," Hamish said, holding up the tiny blue thread. "Have you seen this colour recently? In a dress, perhaps, or a lining?" Nellie squinted at the silk. "That's a very specific shade, Hamish. It's called International Klein Blue. I only know because that quiet Mr. Pringle has a waistcoat lined with the stuff. He wore it to dinner 2 nights ago. He looked quite the gentleman until you noticed how much he liked to watch everyone else's plates." Hamish felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the rain. Mr. Pringle, the historian, the man who bought the chocolates, the man with the blue silk lining. He recalled the sign around Vanne Tempest's neck. Too much ice, never enough. It wasn't the handwriting of a builder or an angry ex-wife. It was the precise, practiced hand of a man who studied archives, a man who appreciated the historical irony of a glutton ying of his own excess. And Nellie, Hamish added, his voice dropping. Did Mr. Pringle have any visitors? Anyone not staying at the hotel? Nellie shook her head. None. But he did spend a lot of time in the library, looking at the old maps of the cannery and the pier. He seemed very interested in the structural integrity of the vats. Hamish thanked her and stepped out. He knew now that Archie was innocent, but he also knew that proving it to Blair would require more than a thread. He needed the motive. He needed to know why a quiet historian would travel all the way to Lochdu to stage a chocolate-coated execution. He looked up at the grey sky, the rain finally beginning to slacken. The hidden motive was there, buried in the past that Pringle claimed to be studying. It wasn't about money Julian had now, it was about the lives he had ruined to get it. The damp air of the laundry room felt suddenly stifling as the significance of the blue silk thread settled in Hamish's mind. He stepped out into the courtyard, the drizzle now a thin, ghostly veil, and began to walk toward the village library, a small, stone-built sanctuary that smelled of damp paper and floor wax. If Mr. Pringle was an amateur historian, he would have spent hours there, and the librarian, Miss McLean, had a memory like a steel trap for every book ever borrowed, and every stranger who dared to linger among her stacks. Hamish found her perched behind the mahogany desk, looking like a small, watchful owl. "Mr. Pringle?" Miss McLean echoed, her voice a sharp whisper that demanded silence, a most medical. As man Hamish, he wasn't interested in the clearances, not really. He spent his time in the local archives looking into the history of the Vanne Group. That was the victim's father's company, you know. They owned a series of care homes in the south before the business collapsed under a cloud of scandal 20 years ago. Financial irregularities, they called it, a polite way of saying they stole the pensions of the elderly and left them with nothing. Hamish leaned his elbows on the desk, his lanky frame casting a long shadow over the records. And did Mr. Pringle find what he was looking for? He found a name, she said, sliding a ledger toward him. A woman named Mary Pringle. She was a resident in one of those homes. She lost everything, her cottage, her savings, her dignity. She died in a state ward shortly after the Vane Group liquidated its assets. Julian Vane Tempest didn't just inherit his father's charm, he inherited the blood money that built his lifestyle. Our historian isn't a researcher, Hamish. He's a son who has been waiting 2 decades for the world to stop looking at the son of a thief as a success story. The motive was no longer a mystery. It wasn't about the current bankruptcy or a lost investment in a wellness retreat. It was a deep generational wound that had never been allowed to heal. Pringle hadn't come to Lochdu to stop a pier from being built. He had come to ensure that the man who lived off the misery of others died in a way that highlighted his insatiable greed. The chocolates weren't just a gimmick, they were a symbol of the excess that had starved Mary Pringle of her final comforts. Hamish thanked Miss McLean and stepped back into the street, his mind heavy with the tragedy of it. He could see the lights of the police station glowing in the distance, where Blair was likely still browbeating Archie McLean. The inspector wanted a brute, but the crime belonged to a poet of vengeance. Pringle had timed everything perfectly, the chase of the chocolates, the planting of the bar in Archie's Land Rover, and the staging of the body to look like a local's crude revenge. But he had been sloppy with his silk. "He'll be planning to leave," Hamish muttered to Lugs. "A man like that won't stay for the funeral. He's finished his work." He checked his watch. The evening bus to Inverness would be departing from the square in less than an hour. If Pringle was the meticulous man Miss McLean described, he would want to be far away before Blair realized that the evidence against Archie was a collection of convenient coincidences. But Hamish knew a straight arrest would be impossible. Blair would never admit he was wrong, and Pringle would have a practiced defense ready for any formal questioning. He needed the man to reveal himself. Elf, to show the arrogance that often lurks behind the mask of a quiet scholar. As he walked toward the square, Hamish's lazy brain began to construct a plan. He wouldn't use handcuffs or sirens. He would use the one thing a man like Pringle couldn't resist, the desire to be understood. He needed to set a trap that played on the killer's sense of intellectual superiority. He stopped by the Tom Castle Hotel bar one last time, not for information, but for a specific prop. He needed to look like the stupid policeman Blair claimed he was, a man so confused by the case that he was looking for answers in all the wrong places. He saw Mr. Pringle sitting in the corner, his suitcase already by his feet, sipping a final glass of sherry with an expression of serene detachment. The blue silk of his waistcoat was just visible beneath his tweed jacket, a tiny electric spark of colour in the dim room. Hamish took a deep breath, adjusted his crooked cap, and began his mooching approach, wearing a look of utter, hopeless bewilderment. Hamish approached the corner table with a heavy, rhythmic tread. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of the day's tragedy was physically crushing him. He cared every bit the defeated village bobby, a man out of his depth and seeking the comfort of a more intelligent mind. Mr. Pringle looked up from his sherry, his pale eyes behind thin spectacles radiating a cold, clinical curiosity. He watched Hamish approach with the same detachment a biologist might reserve for a particularly slow-moving snail. "Och, it's a terrible business, Mr. Pringle," Hamish sighed, pulling out a chair and sinking into it without being asked. Luggs slumped down beside him, resting his chin on his paws and looking equally morose. DCI Blair is up at the station shouting enough to wake the dead, and poor Archie McLean is behind bars for a crime he says he didn't do. But between you and me, sir, and I say this as a man who knows the folk of Lochdu, it just doesn't sit with me. The chocolates, you see, that's what's bothering me. Pringle took a slow, measured sip of his sherry. The chocolates, Constable? I should think that's the most straightforward part of the affair, a local man's clumsy attempt at irony. A bit crude, perhaps, but effective. Is that what you think? Hamish leaned forward, dropping his voice to a confidential whisper. See, that's where... I'm stumped. I found a box of those very same Valrhona truffles in the trash behind the cannery. But the strange thing is, they weren't the ones the killer used. These ones were poisoned, laced with something nasty, I reckon. But the man in the vat didn't die of poison. He was smothered first, then stuffed with the other box. The clean ones... Hamish watched Pringle's hands. The man's fingers didn't tremble, but they tightened almost imperceptibly around the stem of his glass. "Poisoned?" Pringle repeated, his voice silky and neutral. "That seems an unnecessary complication. Why would a killer bother with 2 boxes? Exactly! Hamish slapped the table, making the glasses rattle. It makes no sense, unless the killer bought 2 boxes, one to do the deed quietly and another to make a point. When the first plan failed. Now I've been all over, and I can only find a record of 2 boxes being sold, one to the victim and one to a gentleman staying right here. But the shopkeeper said the gentleman bought them for his sister." Hamish looked directly at Pringle, his blue eyes wide and vacuous. "You wouldn't happen to have that box on you, would you, sir? It would save me a world of trouble. If I can show Blair a full sealed box, I can prove that the sister story was true and stop him from coming down here to search everyone's luggage. He's in a foul mood, sir. He'll have the linings out of every coat in the hotel if he thinks someone's hiding a receipt." Pringle's gaze flickered toward his suitcase. For the first time, a shadow of irritation crossed his scholarly features. He clearly despised the idea of Blair's clumsy hands rummaging through his belongings, but he despised the stupidity of Hamish Macbeth even more. He viewed Hamish as a minor obstacle to be cleared before the bus arrived. "I'm afraid I've already sent them off by post, Constable," Pringle said, his tone dripping with patronizing patience. "A birthday gift, as I mentioned. Surely you're inspect. Or has more pressing leads than a missing confectionery box?" "Och, he does, Hamish agreed, standing up and dusting off his uniform. "He's convinced it's Archie. He even found a blue thread in Archie's van, said it was from a fancy waistcoat. Now, I told him Archie doesn't wear waistcoats, but Blair says the man probably stole it from Vane Tempest. He's going to charge him tonight." Hamish paused, looking down at Pringle with a sudden, feigned spark of realization. "Wait a minute. That's a lovely blue lining you've got there, Mr. Pringle. Almost the exact same shade. What a coincidence. If Blair saw that, he'd probably think you were the one who dropped it in the van while you were planting that chocolate bar." Hamish let the silence stretch, thick and heavy. He watched the realization dawn on Pringle that he wasn't talking to a fool, but to a man who had already tied the noose. Pringle's serenity finally cracked. He realized that the stupid policeman had just placed him at the scene, identified his motive, and linked him to the evidence in Archie's Land Rover, all while mooching for a chat. "You think you're very clever, don't you, Macbeth?" Pringle said, his voice dropping the scholarly facade and becoming a cold, hard rasp. "Not at all, sir," Hamish replied, his face settling into a mask of grim determination. "I'm just a man who likes peace and quiet. And you've gone and made a terrible mess of my afternoon." The serenity of the Tommel Castle Hotel bar vanished as Pringle realized the bus to Inverness was no longer his ticket to freedom, but a distant dream. The scholar's face, previously a mask of intellectual boredom, contorted into a snarl of pure, focused malice. He didn't look like a historian anymore. He looked like a cornered rat with the pedigree of a wolf. With a sudden, violent movement that belied his age, Pringle lunged, not for his suitcase, but for the heavy crystal decanter on the table. He swung it with a desperate strength, aiming or Hamish's temple, but Hamish had spent years ducking the swings of drunken gillies and the sudden lunges of territorial stags. He moved his head an inch to the left, the crystal whistling past his ear, and before Pringle could recover his balance, Hamish's long arm shot out, gripping the man's wrist with the strength of a Highland smithy. Now, Mr. Pringle," Hamish said, his voice dropping. "The village idiot lilt and becoming as cold as the loch water. Violence is a messy business, and you've already left enough of a trail." Pringle didn't surrender. He twisted his body, his free hand reaching into his tweed jacket and pulling out a small, sharp-edged letter opener, the very tool he had likely used to score the sign left on Vane Tempest's body. He slashed at Hamish's chest, catching the wool of his uniform but missing the skin. Lugs, sensing the danger to his master, erupted from the floor in a flurry of barking and snapping jaws, pinning Pringle's leg against the heavy oak table. The killer let out a sharp cry of pain and fear, his footing slipping on the polished floorboards as he tried to kick the dog away. "Let go of me, you red-headed peasant," Pringle hissed, his spectre. Clares sliding down his nose. That man deserved to die. He was a parasite, living off the bones of the people my mother loved. I did the world a service. "Maybe so," Hamish grunted, pinning Pringle against the wall with a practiced efficiency that would have shocked DCI Blair. "But in Lochdu, we prefer to let the law handle the parasites, even if the law is a bit slow and wears a size 16 company. You didn't kill him for justice, Pringle. You killed him because you wanted to feel superior to him. You wanted to be the judge, the jury, and the director of the final act." The struggle was brief but intense. Pringle was fueled by a lifetime of resentment, but Hamish had the quiet, enduring power of the mountains. He twisted the letter opener from the man's grasp and forced his arms behind his back. The commotion finally drew the attention of the hotel staff and the few remaining guests, who stood in the doorway with mouths agape. Among them was Detective Sergeant Anderson, who had been sent by Blair to keep an eye on the locals while the inspector finished his interrogation of Archie McLean. Anderson looked at the scene, Hamish Macbeth holding the respected historian in a wrist. Lock, a letter opener on the floor, and a blue silk waistcoat torn at the shoulder. "Macbeth, what in the name of the Lord is going on here? Blair is going to have your head for this. Then he'll have to take it from the shoulders of a man who's just found his real killer," Hamish panted, his face flushed with the exertion. "Anderson, get your handcuffs out. You might want to tell the inspect. Or to let Archie go. This gentleman here has a waistcoat that matches the thread in the Land Rover, a receipt for 2 boxes of Valrhona truffles in his suitcase, and a very detailed knowledge of why Julian Vane Tempest's father was a thief. He was just about to catch the bus to Inverness to celebrate his history project. Pringle went limp in Hamish's grip, the fire of his rage replaced by a hole. Low, shaking despair. He looked at the door, then at the rain-streaked windows, realizing that his meticulously planned drama had ended not with a standing ovation, but with a dog biting his ankle in a draughty hotel bar. "Take him, Anderson," Hamish said, handing the man over. "And tell Blair I'm sorry about the decanter. It was an antique, I think." As Anderson led the shackled Pringle away, Hamish stood in the centre of the room, straightening his tunic and smoothing his hair. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a deep, hollow fatigue. He had solved the crime, saved Archie, and unmasked a murderer, which meant only one thing: he was in grave danger of being commended. And if he was commended, he would be noticed. If he was noticed, he would be moved. He looked at Lugs, who was wagging his tail and looking for a reward. "Oh, Lugs," Hamish whispered, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the approaching figure of DCI Blair through the lobby windows. "We've a bit more work to do yet. We need to make sure the great man thinks this was all his own brilliant idea." The hotel lobby doors swung open with such force they rattled the framed prints of Highland stags on the walls. DCI Blair arched in, his face a vivid, pulsating shade of crimson that suggested a near-imminent medical event. Behind him, Archie McLean stood free but looking thunderous, while Anderson trailed at the rear, already holding Pringle by the elbow. Blair's eyes locked onto Hamish, and for a moment, the silence in the hotel was so thick it felt like the mountain mist had followed them inside. "Macbeth! Blair!" roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "What is this nonsense Anderson is babbling about? I had a confession nearly wrung out of that builder, and now I'm told you've been playing detective in a bar room with a visiting scholar. If you've botched my arrest with some village superstition, I'll have you peeling potatoes in the Strathbane canteen for the next decade." Hamish adopted his submissive, wide-eyed expression, clutching his cap to his chest as if he were a schoolboy caught stealing apples. He took a hesitant step forward, making sure to stumble slightly over the rug. "Oh, I'm so sorry, sir. Truly I am. I was just sitting here, feeling terrible about how I'd failed to help you properly this morning. I was thinking to myself, Hamish, you've been a fool. You should I've listened to the inspector when he mentioned the psychological profile of the killer." Blair paused, his chest heaving, his suspicion momentarily piqued by the mention of his own perceived brilliance. "The psychological profile? What are you on about, man?" "Well," Hamish continued, his voice dropping into a tone of humble admiration, "I remembered what you said about the theatricality of crime. You mentioned, at least I think it was you, sir, through all the excitement, that the killer had to be someone with a refined, educated mind, someone who understood the irony of the chocolates. So I thought I'd just keep an eye on the most educated person in the village while you were busy with the heavy lifting at the station. And wouldn't you know it, as soon as I mentioned your brilliant theory about the blue thread and the waistcoat, Mr. Pringle here became absolutely white. He tried to attack me, shouting about how your cleverness had been seen right through his historical research." Blair's eyebrows shot up. He glanced at Pringle, who was currently slumped in Anderson's grip, then back at Hamish. I did mention the thread, didn't I? And the waistcoat. It was a primary line of inquiry." "It was indeed, sir," Hamish lied smoothly, his face a mask of earnest sincerity. "If you hadn't focused so clearly on the motive of greed and social revenge, I never would have known what to look for. I was just the lure, sir. I just sat here and let your theories do the work. It's a pity the credit will all go to the big city detectives, but I suppose that's the way of the world. You'll probably be on the Gazette's front page for this one. DCI Blair unmasks the scholarly assassin. It has a fine ring to it. The transformation in Blair was instantaneous. The purple hue faded to a triumphant pink, and he straightened his tie, puffing out his chest until the buttons of his coat strained. The prospect of glory acted on him like a tonic. He looked at the cowering Pringle with the eyes of a hunter who had just bagged a trophy. "Yes, well," Blair huffed, clearing his throat and assuming a grave, authoritative tone. It was a complex web, Macbeth. A lesser officer might have been fooled by the builder's obviousness, but I knew there was a deeper, more intellectual malice at play. Chocolate was a dead giveaway from the start. Anderson, get this man to the car. I have a press statement to draft before we reach Strathbane. And Macbeth. Yes, sir? Hamish asked, projecting an aura of grateful insignificance. Don't go thinking this excuses your general laziness. You got lucky today by following my lead. Keep your nose clean, and I might forget to mention the broken decanter in my report. Thank you, sir. You're very kind, Hamish murmured. He watched as Blair ched out, shouting orders, and already rehearsing his speech for the chief constable. Archie McLean lingered for a second, giving Hamish a slow, knowing nod of his head before disappearing into the night. As the police cars roared away, their sirens fading into the distance, Hamish let out a long, shuddering breath. He felt the weight of the promotion he had just dodged lifting off his shoulders. He looked at Luggs, who was sniffing at a stray chocolate wrapper on the floor. That was a close one, Luggs, Hamish whispered. Another 5 minutes of brilliance, and they'd have had me in a suit and a desk in Inverness. Let Blair have the headlines. I'd rather have my stove and a quiet loch. The hotel bar gradually returned to its usual state of hushed, expensive boredom as the last echoes of Blair's shouting faded into the Highland night. Hamish stood for a moment longer in the lobby, feeling the tension drain out of his muscles like water through the mountain scree. He had successfully navigated the most treacherous part of any investigation, the risk of being recognized as a competent policeman. To the tourists and the hotel staff, he was once again just the lanky, red-haired Bobby, who had somehow stumbled into a solution, while more important men did the thinking. He whistled low for Luggs, and together they stepped back out into the cool, damp embrace of the Lochdu evening. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind that sharp, clean scent of peat and wet heather that Hamish loved more than any city perfume. The village was quiet now, the yellow lights of the cottages reflecting in the obsidian surface of the loch. As he walked toward the police station, a shadow detached itself from the doorway of the grocery store. It was Mr. Johnson, looking small and weary, but no longer terrified. "He's gone then, Hamish?" the grocer asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The big man from Strathbane? He's gone, Mr. Johnson," Hamish replied, stopping to give the man a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "He's off to tell the world how he saved us all from a scholarly menace. You can sleep easy tonight. Your avocados are safe, even if Julian Vane Tempest isn't here to complain about them." Mr. Johnson let out a shaky laugh. "I owe you a dream, Hamish, or at least a decent biscuit box, not the gold-wrapped ones. Mind you, I think I've seen enough chocolate to last a lifetime." Hamish smiled and continued his journey home. When he reached the station, he didn't head for the desk or the filing cabinets. He went straight to the small, cosy kitchen in the back. He stoked the fire in the iron stove until the embers glowed a fierce, comforting orange, then set a blackened kettle on to boil. Luggs settled onto high, Rugg with a contented sigh, his tail occasionally thumping the floor as he dreamed of chasing Pringle through a forest of giant sausages. As the water began to hum, Hamish sat at the wooden table and pulled out a local newspaper from the previous day. He looked at the headline about Vane Tempest's ambitious plans for the pier and sighed. The dreamer was gone, and while his death was a tragedy, sorts, the village would breathe easier without the threat of his rejuvenation. The Highlands had a way of absorbing outsiders, either by changing them or, as in Julian's case, by rejecting them with a violent, poetic finality. Hamish poured himself a mug of thick, dark coffee, no sugar, he'd had enough sweetness for one day, and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small silver fishing lure. He had forgotten was there. Tomorrow, he decided, he would finally get to the river. There was a specific pool beneath the old bridge where the salmon liked to rest after a heavy rain, and with Blair busy writing reports and posing for photographers, Hamish was certain he could spend the entire morning in blissful, productive laziness. The telephone on the desk rang once, a sharp, intrusive sound. D in the quiet kitchen. Hamish stared at it for a long moment, his hand poised over his mug. It rang a second time, then a third. He didn't move. He knew it would be headquarters, or perhaps a journalist looking for a quote, or even Cynthia Vane Tempest wanting to complain about her luggage. He waited until the ringing stopped, replaced by the crackling of the fire and the distant rhythmic lap of the loch against the shore. "Let them wait, lugs," he murmured, taking a long, hot sip of his coffee. "The world can get along just fine without PC Macbeth for a few hours." He leaned back in his chair, stretching his long legs out toward the heat of the stove. He was exactly where he wanted to be, in a village that didn't expect too much of him, in a house that smelled of peat smoke, with a dog tea. Hat didn't care about promotions. The murder of Julian Vane Tempest would be a story told in the pub for years to come, a cautionary tale about greed and the long memory of the Highlands. But for Hamish, it was already fading into the mist, just another disruption in the slow, beautiful rhythm of life in Lochdu. He closed his eyes, listened to the wind rattling the window pane, and finally, truly, relaxed. The stillness of the kitchen was eventually broken by a soft, rhythmic tapping at the back door. Hamish didn't start. He merely opened one eye, recognizing the specific, hesitant knock of someone who didn't want to be seen. He rose, his joints popping, and opened the door to find Archie McLean standing in the shadows of the eaves, a heavy burlap sack in his hand. "I'm no a man for spay." "Exis, Hamish," Archie grunted, thrusting the sack toward him. The smell of cold river water and fresh scales drifted into the warm kitchen, but the cells in Strathbane are cold, and Blair's voice is like a rasp on a saw. "You got me out of there. This is just a bit of justice for the pan." Hamish peered into the bag at the silver-bright belly of a magnificent 10-pound salmon. "Och, Archie, yo." "You shouldn't have. The warden has been prowling that stretch of the river like a hungry cat all evening." The warden was busy watching the blue lights of the police cars leaving the village, Archie said with a rare, toothy grin. "Good night to you, Hamish." Hamish watched the big man vanish into the mist before closing the door. He set the salmon on the draining board, admiring the clean lines of the fish. It was the perfect end to a day that had threatened to be entirely too productive. He knew that by tomorrow morning, the official version of the death of a dreamer would be set in stone. Blair would take the credit. Pringle would be a footnote in a criminal psychologist's textbook, and the village would go back to pretending that nothing ever happened in Lochdu. He picked up a small, handwritten note that had been tucked under the kitchen clock earlier that afternoon. It was from Priscilla. "The blue was nice, Hamish. Father says the peer project has been officially scrapped. Come for tea on Sunday. I promise there will be no chocolates." He tucked the note into his pocket, a small smile playing on his lips. He had kept his peace, kept his job, and secured a world-class din. For the next 2 days. As he began preparing the fish, he thought of Pringle. The man had been right about one thing. Julian Vane Tempest had been a parasite, but Pringle had forgotten that in the Highlands, the environment eventually takes care of its own pests. You didn't need a staged execution or a box of poisoned sweets. You just needed to wait for the land to assert itself. He finished cleaning the salmon, wrapped it in damp paper, and placed it in the cool larder. Then he returned to his chair by the stove, the fire now a deep, pulsing red. He reached out and switched off the single electric light, leaving the room illuminated only by the flicker of the peat embers. Lugs let out a long, whistling breath in his sleep. Hamish followed suit, sinking deep into the cushions. The case was closed, the intruder was gone, and the silence of the Highlands, heavy, ancient, and utterly indifferent to the dramas of men, settled over the police station once more. He was Hamish Macbeth, the lazy policeman of a sleepy village. As far as he was concerned, that was the greatest mystery of all, why anyone would ever want to be anything else.